Wow, wow, wow. We are live. World Series News, Jason Q Citizen, brand new live broadcast today. This is the one that you're going to share far and wide. I promise you that off the bat. I'm so excited. Simon from Florida is on the line. Going to bring him in just a moment. The big news, as you saw from the headline, is Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy. The march for the White House is well and truly on. Robert Kennedy Jr. has given a 2-hour speech that has shaken the foundations of the establishment as only the Kennedys can do, and it is rousing. As you know, this is the 7th broadcast. You don't know that, but this is the 7th time that Simon has joined me in the last few weeks as we are compiling the information and news from around the world as the world is truly changing before our eyes. And Robert Kennedy Jr., many are already saying they're going to take him out. And this is a very brave 69-year-old son of slain Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who was, of course, the brother of the assassinated President John F. Kennedy. And we've all been wondering when the Kennedy name will come back to save America. And if anything is to go by, the speech that he has just given is such a speech. Now, Kennedy, a Democrat, and many, of course, from the MAGA movement, Trump, a Republican, are wondering what this all means. And there's no one better to be able to get down to the nitty-gritty of it all as we look to see how America may well yet be saved. Simon is in the background. He's warming up his tonsils. We've got a big show. It's going to be around about an hour. I am going to play you a tune that will get your spine tingling, and you don't want to go anywhere. And if you can, because this is live and I don't do lives very often, but please share this far and wide. It's on the World Series News page, the Jason Q Citizen page, and for the first time on the Jason Q Citizen Twitter page, it should be going out live there as well. And goodness me, I hope it's all working. This is super exciting. Now, warm up. Simon will be here in 30 seconds and counting. Simon, welcome all the way from Florida. This is truly an historic moment that Robert Kennedy Jr., 18 years in the censorship wilderness, has emerged, and he has said that he has a lot to say. Welcome to World Series News and the Jason Q Citizen Show.
Hello there, Jason. Well, the audience will soon see the purpose of that little clip that you played there. It has a double meaning and is directly quoted from Robert Kennedy's speech today. Now, we've been expecting this for a week, and for that week, the mainstream media has been viciously attacking him, claiming that he's literally a anti-vax lunatic, and so they've tried to downplay the effect of this. Unfortunately, the audio at the beginning of the speech was not too good. His timing in terms of literally what time of day it was broadcast was rather odd. It was 5 p.m. London, 12 noon Boston, where he was, and 9 a.m. Los Angeles. I happened to be in a restaurant for lunch just as it started. I'd planned to go there, assuming that it would be an hour with an earpiece. It actually rolled to an hour and 56 minutes. And whilst I was extremely moved by the content of the speech, and I was actually sending contemporaneous notes to several other journalists and news organizations that I knew weren't listening to it live because they hadn't anticipated it being quite so momentous. As I looked around the restaurant, and there was probably about another 100 people there, it occurred to me that I was almost certainly the only person out of those 100 people that was actually listening to it. And so whilst, as the audience will tell, it was very relevant to us all, it was obviously a multi-generational event, and he's clearly following in both his father's and his uncle's footsteps. And he had a real sense of history in terms of the date on which he chose to make his announcement. But I really think that his media and communications team are going to need to wise up quite a bit. And the point that I'll make here, and hopefully we'll have time to reinforce at the end, is that if people are motivated by this and do feel moved and do feel that they want to support this candidacy, then it's going to be upon those individuals, those members of your audience, to actually get out, get involved, share this recording with them, share the link to the original speech that we're going to provide as well, and get the message out, because this is truly, like Trump in 2015, a grassroots revolutionary movement. And you'll see as we get to that point later in our discussion how he does specifically say that this type of outreach is necessary, and that this is what his father and Martin Luther King had envisaged, both for the civil rights movement and with RFK's own presidential campaign in 1967 and 1968. So there's a lot of history here. There's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of things to learn. There's a lot of hot button issues that your audience, I'm absolutely certain, are interested in and have been living through, both in America and in Britain and in Australia for the last 3 years.
Simon, it's automatic shivers up the spine. This whole story begins when his uncle is taken out. November 22nd, 1963. We feel like we've been watching this for 60 years, literally, and we're not even that old. But Bobby Kennedy Jr. is 69 years of age. He's seen this. He was 9 years old, the age of my youngest son. And he'd certainly be truly well aware of what's been going on. It is his life's work, and this is a man that has gone out against the grain and has stood up for principles and has stood up for what his uncle and his father had done, and is truly mesmerizing all of us right now, because we all thought of him as the insignificant little nephew or cousin of John F. Kennedy Jr., who was taken out in 1999 one way or another. Many of us thought that maybe this was the big coup, the big secret, that JFK may even be still alive in all of this, and now it's his cousin, his older cousin, Bobby Robert Kennedy Jr., who is out here. There is so much. If all the world is a stage, we are now entering into the biggest stage of all, that the race for the White House. Let's get down to the business of what he was talking about in this speech, and truly anyone watching here, anyone who is a fan of the Kennedys, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, and I'm going to mention some acronyms. You've got FDR, JFK, RFK, and MLK, and Simon's going to fill us in what his RFK Jr. has said about that in the speech, but we're going to talk deeply about the establishment, the military-industrial complex. We're going to talk about, God forbid, what they put inside the vials and the vile results of what happens when you take something that you otherwise wouldn't, and Kennedy has spoken about that in the speech on YouTube. So YouTube, when you get this speech, you can shove that where it fits best, because we are now using political speech, and there's not much you're going to be able to say about that. We're going to talk about foreign policy, possibly even Ukraine war. There is not one stone that Kennedy has left untouched, and that is why many people are suggesting that he may be taken out. And if he's taken out at that point, we will realise for 1,000% certain that the corruption that goes along in all government around the world is in fact true, and we'll have to understand that there is nothing more than that. We don't want this to happen. We want the truth to come in other ways, and this is yet another brave Kennedy putting it out there for service to God and country. Simon, let's get on with it.
So to set the scene, he was speaking at a hall in Boston, and the reason why, obviously, he had chosen that place not just because the Kennedys had been widely associated with Massachusetts for many years, but indeed he mentioned in his introductory remarks that that is where his ancestors had arrived fleeing British oppression from Ireland in Boston in 1848. So that was the reason for the choice of the location. And it's important, just like the Da Vinci Code, for people to start thinking about, history and symbols and dates. So, this really is something for people to kind of like play along with, and the conspiracy theorists can all go wild. In terms of the actual day of the year, yesterday was the eve 242 years ago, when Paul Revere, the famous writer, started on his epic journey to warn the people that the British are coming, the British are coming. And then the following day, the Minutemen had gathered at the North Bridge, and they had quite a battle against the British. And he specifically explained that this was no coincidence. He had specifically chosen this date. So he is truly launching a revolutionary movement, hence the day that he chose to make his announcement. So, these are, in American history, they're quite grand dates. Everybody knows Paul Revere, everybody knows the Minutemen. So when you're tapping into those, both in location and date, it is very, very meaningful. And he's gone to length to spell that out. Now, he then explained that the part of the reason for that revolution had started 2 years beforehand with the Tea Party action in 1773, where American colonialists had disguised themselves as Indians, boarded a British ship that was stocked full of tea, and dumped it all into the harbour, which was a protest against the tax that had been imposed upon all the tea merchants, with the exception of the British East India Company, that effectively gave them a monopoly. And the king and many of the British aristocracy were shareholders in that company, and so they were going to benefit greatly by having a monopoly on the sale of tea within the American colonies. So he said that the outrage at that point, and this is a direct quote here, was fury against a corrupt merger of state and corporate power. I mean, so the message there is just so clear that that's exactly what we can see in today's society. And indeed, that is essentially the definition of fascism, when you've got the corporatocracy merging with the government. And so he then goes on to say that his mission is to counteract the threat that exists now to impose a new corporate feudalism on our country and to commoditize our children. He goes on to say that the powers are seeking to poison our children and our people with chemicals and pharmaceutical drugs, to strip mine our assets, hollow out our middle class, and keep us in a constant state of war. Now, how much does that paragraph describe the society in which we're all living today?
Oh, it's unbelievable. It is exactly what is going on, and he's called them out in real time here. This is incredible, Simon.
Yeah. So he further says, talking about the general political environment, that it's the most toxic since the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, and that many people are now preparing for a dystopian future.
Wow, he's called it.
He really has called it there, hasn't he? So he then says his further mission is to end division, enhance common values, and to do so by telling the truth, which is the end to that song you've just played. Its truth is marching on. And we'll come to see how indeed that theme is a multi-generational theme, that whilst he doesn't believe that he's following in the footsteps of Christ, he definitely believes that he's following in the footsteps of his father and his uncle. And I'm sure this is highly motivating him. And it'd be interesting to see, given that that was indeed 60 and 55 years ago, whether or not the youngsters of today will be able to embrace that concept. But one of the terms that we've talked about on several of the shows in terms of American foreign policy and previous British and Roman imperial foreign policy was one of intending to divide and rule. And he says that the top people in American society, that is exactly how they're trying to manage not only American foreign policy, but also American domestic policy. And he specifically says by setting rich against poor and white against black and other social groups against each other. And he says that we have to overcome that situation, which is undoubtedly true. Any comments so far?
Look, the fact that he's finally putting it out there and he's not mincing words in relation to our children, this is a very, very big. It's the biggest story of all, of course, because this is where he's been vilified and this is where the media is going straight after him to try and knock him out at this particular stage. Can you give us a little bit more detail on the language that he has used here in determining just how big a problem it is with our children or the children of the United States and, of course, around the world?
Yes.
And has he given any sort of magnitude in terms of the cost that it may be, what he's talking about?
Yes. And so later in the speech, he goes into that in detail, and I will indeed cover those. So I'll address those points exactly. But if I go through it in the same chronology that he actually used, it would be easier for people to check back against the actual text and video of the speech. So he then goes into discussing faith in government and trust in the media. Okay. And so he starts to say that in 1960, nobody believed that the American government would lie to the citizenry. And at that point, a lady in the audience literally shrieks out laughing because she thinks he's making a joke. And he actually pauses his speech and says to her, "No, ma'am, I'm not joking. In 1960, that is what people thought." Right?
Yeah.
So he goes on to explain that the U-2, which is a type of surveillance plane, which is still used now, and I believe the Australian Air Force may still have a few copies of it in existence. It was a high-altitude reconnaissance plane. And one went missing flying over the Soviet Union, as it was at that point. And the American government issued a blanket denial. We have no spy planes flying over Russia.
Yes.
Okay? Everybody accepted that. And rather more competently than they're proceeding now, the Soviets allowed the denials to go on and on and on because the Americans figured that if the plane was shot down at 60, 70,000 feet altitude, that there was no way that the pilot would have survived.
Yes.
Now, what they didn't realize when they were making all their denials was, in fact, the pilot had survived and he'd been captured by the Russians. So after setting themselves up for this great revelation, the Soviets then produced the pilot, Gary Powers, and the entire American population was stunned. Bear in mind, this is a long time ago, that their government had in fact been just flat out lying for days and days and days. And obviously we saw that kind of like type of propaganda continue well on into the course of the Vietnam War. He went then further to explain that during 1970, 1971, that point was reinforced to the American populace with the publication in the Washington Post and the New York Times of the famous Pentagon Papers, which had been photocopied and leaked from the Rand Corporation. And he further explained that his father, before he died, had explained to him that all those in authority sadly tended to lie. So he said that we'd gone from a situation 60 years ago when 80% of the people trusted the government to tell them the truth, and that as of last year, that had gone down to 22%. And he said that it was coincidental that 22% was also the level of public trust in the American mainstream media. And you have to bear in mind that MSNBC and NBC and CBS and ABC and CNN, They were all in the room. So he's looking directly at them, like Trump would often do in his rallies. And he said directly to the cameras, the media lies and everybody knows.
That is just, it's the statement we've all been waiting for forever, Simon. It's just truly, truly extraordinary. The media lies and everybody
Body
knows.
knows. So he then further said the government and mainstream media brand alternative news sources, such as yourself, as misinformation and consider that it threatens their paradigm. Paradigm is a standard operating procedure or a method of doing business. Basically, it's the status quo. It would be another phrase for the paradigm. He says they either censor or lie,
Yes.
and that amplifies polarization, hatred, fear, and insecurity.
Yes.
Censorship in itself is dangerous.
Yes. He's absolutely nailed this, and the point I want to make about that, Simon, at this point is that the government who is in the business of monopolising truth, and we've just learnt from Robert Kennedy Jr. that only 22% now believe the media, they use that, and so anyone who opposes them or presents alternate information because the government chooses to ignore particular information is deemed as misinformation. And so how the government plays in that situation, therefore, and the media is they say, well, if you are delivering misinformation, therefore ours is always the truth in the matter, and therefore you can't have two truths, and therefore you're disqualified from the simple reason that you are not us and you are not the authority. And this is the part and the hardest part of all of this, is that you can have one political opponent saying one thing, the opposite saying the other, and the dominant narrative controlling the day. And this is where Kennedy has arrived. Now, this is absolutely massive, because once we realise that nobody believes in the media, the emperor truly has no clothes, Simon.
And isn't that exactly what we've seen in Australia and New Zealand, particularly under Ardern, and in Canada now under Trudeau with the C11 bill, and with the censorship acts that are going forward in the United Kingdom? I mean, what he's talking about here is not being dispelled at the moment. It's tightening and tightening upon all of us. So that's something very much to bear in mind. That hasn't died with COVID. It's now being rolled out in relation to digital IDs, CBDCs, 15-minute cities, and all of the such, like the WHO treaty. All of us who are attempting to warn the populace not just about the grand scheme of things, but also the horrific technical details. We're still being constantly maligned as conspiracy theorists, when all we're doing is reading out government documents where they tell us exactly how they're going to construct the prison around us.
Yeah, indeed. It's
so to continue on, just so we don't
yes,
run out of time.
Of course.
So he mentioned that when his father was running, which was a long shot campaign, that just as he's now running against Biden, who in theory is eligible for another 4-year term, that his father was running against the sitting Democratic president, which I believe at the time was Johnson. And it was also during a time of war, which obviously we've got now the same situation with Ukraine. And there was also great political polarization due to people resisting the draft for the Vietnam War that was occurring in 1967 and 68. And he felt, his father, that he confided to his family, that he really had no chance of winning, because liberals were against him, the press were against him, and also most of the unions were against him. But in exactly the same way that RFK Jr. is taking on the establishment and the military-industrial complex and the mainstream media and big pharma, which obviously is the big addition to the military-industrial complex, just like his father, and just like we saw in the closing moments of that famous American hymn, that he now feels that he has the freedom to tell the truth. And so this is why his candidacy is so important, because even if he isn't eventually successful, imagine the impact that he can have if he's on 3 or 4 rounds of presidential debates and even taking this message nationwide. And because of his family's political status in the last 175 years of history of the United States, the obligation that they feel in order to cover him, even though they resent him saying truth to power almost as much as they hate Trump.
Yes, indeed. And this is it's powerful, isn't it? That now we have someone on the Democrat side, someone on the Republican side that is hated as much as Trump, and yet he is the original political establishment pretty much for anyone alive today. I mean, we're going back 63 years or something until when Kennedy was elected. This takes on most of the people alive today. Unbelievable. And so now both sides of the political persuasion are now affected. It's interesting because there has been talk about Roger Stone coming out this week talking about a unified ticket, Trump-Kennedy. I know you're not supporting that one, and it opens up a whole Pandora's box, but this is massive now because I tell you what, Biden looks old, decrepit, and completely yesterday's news with a rejuvenated Kennedy, who's only about 11 or 12 years younger than Biden, but looks like a generation younger at this stage, Simon.
But unfortunately, he has this long-term problem with his voice. So he finds it difficult to speak for long periods of time, not because he has any mental infirmity, but literally he has a problem with like his vocal cords. And so he sounds like he's been a smoker for 60 years, but I don't believe that's actually the nature of his condition. But it does make for not just an accent, but his cadence is out. He can't modulate the volume as much as one would anticipate. I wouldn't say that it's a monotone. It's not like a continuous note, but it does take quite a bit of getting used to. And I think it's going to make him doing stump speeches 3 or 4 times a day, which is what Trump was doing when he ran both times, very hard to compete with, simply because I think it's almost inevitable that if he were to do that even for a couple of weeks, he would just completely lose his voice. He literally has a physical disability in terms of how he can speak, and so you know, he's already being criticized for that in terms of his communication skills. But like, nobody was criticizing Roosevelt for being in a wheelchair. Nobody criticizes the governor of Texas for being in a wheelchair. So he's not relying upon sign language. It's just that it is a little bit difficult to understand him at certain points. So going back to how he was describing his father's campaign, he did a nationwide tour of reaching out to the youth by going to many universities across America. And he went to one, which was a Catholic university, actually in Utah, I believe he said. And what he was doing was going to all of these centers of learning, but taking a message that was very much at odds with the accepted narrative. So this is all part of the kind of like, you know, revolutionary step. So in this example, he went to this Catholic university where all of the students were benefiting from having their conscription for the Vietnam War and deployment into combat, in many cases, deferred because specifically they were at college. And he said to them, this is his father speaking, that he had 10 children and that he, as a lawyer, could afford to send all of them to university. But he said currently in Vietnam, and this was like in 1967 when there was a lot of military activity in Vietnam, he said 45% of the paratroopers in Vietnam are black. bear in mind, this is when blacks were probably 8 or 9% of the population, if that. So they were like 5 times overrepresented in the combat arms. And he said that that was because their parents couldn't afford to send them to university. And so he said that one of the things he would do, if elected, would be to end the deferment that people got by saying that they were going to get to university rather than registering and serving their national service overseas. And initially, the entire auditorium was very, very much against him. But he said to them, he said, well, if you're Catholics and you believe in common service and equality, why do you think that it's appropriate for a black teenager to go and serve in your place simply because your parents can afford for you to go to university? And he reasoned with them. And by the end of his speech, he got a standing ovation. And he did this again and again and again, taking a counter narrative to particular audiences and winning them over, which just goes to show not only his oratory skills, but also his great debating skills. And indeed, RFK Jr. claimed that whilst he had been with his father as a 14-year-old on the day that he was assassinated, that on that day, he had won in the primaries the state of California and also the state of South Dakota, which at the time was the most urban state and the most rural state. It was the most liberal state and the most conservative or traditional state. And he won them both on the same day, the day that he was killed. And the way he had done that was by telling the truth. And this is the theme that is repeated again and again and again through his speech, and I think is likely to be the cornerstone of the campaign. And so he then goes to mention that the body was transferred back, I believe, to Philadelphia, and then it was taken by train on a trip that should have taken 2.5 hours. But because there were so many bystanders and people crossing the tracks in order to say fond farewell to Bobby Kennedy in much the same way as they had done with Roosevelt when he died in 1945, that he saw crowds of black and white men, particularly standing in the urban train stations in New Jersey, he mentioned in particular. And what was significant is they were singing the battle hymn of the Republic. And that was the last few lines of that you played in your opening segment. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a lot to non-American audience, but I need to briefly explain this hymn, which is quite long and is set both for small choirs and for enormous choirs like the Mormon Tabernacle, and is very historical. It was written, it's believed, by a army priest in 1861 or 1862, and like the famous song by Marlene Dietrich, Lily Marlene, that was adopted equally by the French, the Germans, and the British during World War II. Both the Confederate Army and the Union Army thoroughly embraced this song, which, whilst it has phrases like glory, glory, hallelujah, is not a glorification of death or a battle, but despite the name, Battle Hymn of the Republic, but it's really about sacrifice and redemption and resurrection. And you have to bear in mind that America was extremely religious in the 1860s and 1870s. And so this is a hymn now that still may be sung in churches. And I would say that the the British equivalent, for example, would be the hymn that was sung at the funeral of Margaret Thatcher, Princess Diana, and also Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1965, which was "I vow to thee, my country." And so that is the Commonwealth equivalent of the American battle hymn of the Republic. It's extremely moving and very poignant and used on state occasions. But in that point there, he was making the point that it was black people and white people finding common cause, and yet the same racial divide that his uncle had attempted to heal by desegregating the schools and also by passing the Civil Rights Act, that just 10 years later in 1972, there was a complete division of the races again. And there was very much then a split between blacks going to the Democrats and whites going to the Republicans. And that was a kind of like a reshift or a regression of American society. And he had a thought in mind there that he went to explain. And he said that it's very easy for people to revert to the darker side of our nature. And he went on to explain that that could be the lesser angels of darkness. So I suppose the good angel on one shoulder and the kind of like temptation of the devil on the other shoulder. And he said that that was achieved by appealing to bigotry, greed, anger, and hatred. And he said that just once in a while, someone would come along who could talk to the people in order to have them transcend narrow self-interest, fear, bigotry, and anger, and to make them feel part of community, part of a noble experiment, and to embrace the hero that all of us have in our hearts. So, very, very strong philosophical point that he was making there. Some, I think, may leap onto the whole idea of community and it takes a village to raise a child and community linked to communism and stuff like that. But I personally, I don't really think that was what he had in mind. If you remember that famous line from one of the Kennedy speeches, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And so that was very much the kind of line that he was playing there. And he said that it was very important to avoid that for individuals to avoid the seduction of the notion that in order to advance, it was necessary to do so by leaving the poorest in society behind. And he also said that security, and this is very much one of the messages from the founding fathers, that security should not be gained through getting rid of our constitutional rights. Now, that's something that will very, very much appeal to the conservatives. That's a extremely strong belief that the sacrifice that what is it? It's the achievement of safety should not be done by the sacrifice of liberty. I believe that's a paraphrase of the quote from one of the founding fathers.
Yes.
And so for what you can see that he's trying to straddle the political divide. By one moment he's talking about community and bringing the poor along with the advancement of society, and then the next moment he's very much talking about not sacrificing constitutional rights. And you'll see it in a moment why he made that point. So he then goes to look on in detail at his history as an environmental advocate and an environmental lawyer, and he said that even when he was working then, he wasn't just working at people who were trying to, shut down every factory and every business. He was also working with conservatives, what he called the hook and bullet crowd. And he said that it was very important for America to understand that hunters and fishermen had a great vested interest in making sure that nature was preserved, because that's something that they enjoy and participate, every weekend and every hunting season. So he talked in detail about working with the Hudson River community, which was the subject of an enormous amount of pollution for many, many decades. And he went on to say that this was about enforcing environmental laws, not necessarily about breaking other laws with unauthorized forms of protest. And he mentioned that he had launched 500 successful actions against corporate polluters and had really cleaned up the Hudson River and set it as an example for water keepers and river watchers in over 46 countries. But there was a sad ending to that story when General Electric was discharging its PCB waste into the river, which resulted in a $1 billion cleaning effort. But he said that there's still another 3.5 billion to do that is unfunded and indeed may never ever be done. And indeed, the great restoration that they had achieved was all undone. And now fish can't be commercially taken from the Hudson River because the contamination levels are so high. So, once again, he was showing the fragility of good and how just a moment's neglect could actually undo decades of hard work. And he went on to describe the public servants who were supposed to be stopping those kind of activities as indentured servants in the capital. So he generally doesn't think very highly of the sitting members of Congress. So it'd be interesting to see how that goes over with the rest of the elected members of the Democrat Party. Probably a fair statement. But once again, he's approaching this, despite his name, almost as an independent. And it was interesting today when I was on the George Galloway show that Mr. Galloway commented at the end that he felt that if Robert Kennedy Jr. was stitched up, I think the phrase was that he used, as Bernie Sanders had been, that rather than backing down and allowing a establishment candidate to run on some meaningless platform, that he should definitely consider a third party candidacy. I don't know whether there's any hope for that, but that's what Mr. Galloway was suggesting, having himself been tucked up by the Labour Party and run as an independent and won twice. But that was for an independent single parliamentary seat as opposed to a nationwide election to become head of state. So he then had a very interesting turn of phrase that he used. He said that the 10,000 generations of human beings that had lived before the invention of the laptop ultimately connected us to God. And so he was making this point in terms of the importance of humans' connection to nature. And he said that it was only through that we could maintain a sense of the divine and understand who God is and our own potential as human beings. So you can see that there were some very highfalutin phrases that he was using here. And he said that it was important to remember that during the Great Depression, that nature had been society's social safety net, because people were able to go out and hunt and fish and trap. And he said that now that was completely impossible, and that it was hard to see how, in the event of a real economic collapse, that people would be able to fend for themselves in that manner. Exactly halfway through, he made the point that he was only halfway through his speech, an hour into it, and he said that this is what happens when you censor someone for 18 years. So he obviously had a lot that he wanted to get off his chest. He then talked about the golden era of the American economy, and he said that that was the period of 1945 to 1975, which I wouldn't necessarily agree with those dates personally. Obviously, we had the first oil shock in 1973, so you could quibble a couple of years either way, but that was the dates that he chose. And he said that there was no democracy without a large middle class, and that had been under attack since the 1980s. But the coup de grace, which is the death blow, and once again, I'm not sure exactly how much of his audience would have been familiar with that phrase coup de grace, particularly with a French pronunciation, had indeed been the lockdown during the pandemic. And he said that that was the biggest shift in wealth in US history, when over 500 new billionaires were created, the middle class was destroyed, and that he personally blamed President Trump. And that even though Trump claimed that he had been deceived by his civil servants and bureaucrats, that as the chief executive officer and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, it was ultimately Trump's responsibility. And that indeed is true. That's the whole nature of command responsibility. And therefore, he had to be held accountable. And he said that the worst thing after the economy was the effect on civil rights. And he said, obviously, that the pandemic protocols for the World Health Organization and lots of state preparedness plans were, in fact, just to safeguard the vulnerable, to isolate the sick, but that all of the regular working folks should be allowed to go about their business in order that society could be maintained, and there should be no lockdowns. And he said all of that was thrown out of the window, as we well know. He pointed out that America was only 4.2% of the world's population, but that it had 16% of the deaths. And he said that it was essential for the media, by which he meant the mainstream media, to stop saying that America's COVID response was a success story. And he then used the phrase, he said, no, it was an economic cataclysm. Cataclysm was the exact word that he used. And he said that social media companies were colluding and conspiring with the White House to censor alternative viewpoints, whilst at the same time profiteering from that being the last remaining means of communication and from people working from home. And he said that Amazon had been complicit in putting 3.3 million small companies out of business, and that the White House under Trump was colluding with a lot of those online retailers. He pointed out that 41% of black-owned businesses were shut down, and many of them never reopened. In terms of the effect on children, he said that children in early education had lost up to 21 IQ points, and that a third were now in remedial education. And the CDC, rather than trying to repair the damage, instead had revised all of the educational milestones. And somebody in the crowd then shouted out, "They're evil," referring to the CDC, which I think many people might well agree with. He talked at length about the effects of abuse and children considering suicide, and not getting school lunches and massive weight gains, which then led to further obesity, which then made people even more prone to actually getting serious outcomes from the COVID infection itself, because it was well known that if you had obesity or were very low in vitamin D, that made you more at risk. He talked about the First Amendment being right at the front of the Bill of Rights for a reason. And he said, and this, I was very moved by this, so I'll read this one exactly. He said, if you give government license to silence its critics, then you give it license for any other atrocity that follows.
Yes, indeed.
He said that they then constrained worship and then assembly. They violated the Fifth Amendment. They shut down businesses, suspended jury trials, which was against the Seventh Amendment, and prevented people from claiming protections because they weren't able to sue government agencies, because they were all essentially given immunity if they were involved in any form of countermeasures. And indeed, that's the theme that Karen Kingston and Sasha Latipova have made the point of, that these weren't medical remedies, they were military countermeasures that gave them immunity from any kind of lawsuits. He then explained that this idea that there were exceptions to the Constitution due to public health emergencies was not valid, and that the framers of the Constitution, both during the Revolutionary War, shortly afterwards, and during the ratification years of the Constitution, which took 9 years, there were indeed many pandemics. There was an outbreak of smallpox, there was malaria, and there were several outbreaks of cholera. So he said that the framers of the US Constitution were well acquainted with the nature of pandemics, and yet nowhere within either the original document or the Bill of Rights was there anything saying all of this goes out a window if a few people get the sniffles. And he then had this great line that he said, the Constitution was built for hard times, not easy times. I mean, that's another great one. He said that even Lincoln had tried to suspend habeas corpus during the American Civil War and had been prevented from doing so, in part, I must add, in part, by the US Supreme Court, who had said that the Constitution was the heart and soul of our country. And people need to understand, particularly in Britain, where essentially there is no written constitution, and there isn't really much of a written constitution in Australia either, is there? And so these are very much conservative talking points. So a lot of liberals think that the American Constitution is being taken too literally. It's not being treated as a living document. They want to significantly amend it, particularly to do away with the rights of gun ownership. And so these points that he is making is really mass appeal to independents and conservatives. And so that's important for the international audience to understand. He then had another great phrase when he was talking about how, once again, he reiterated this point, how Trump had really been bamboozled by people on the COVID task force like Fauci and Birx and Redfield and Azar and Bright, for example. He didn't name them all by name, but that's me giving you an example of people who were on the COVID task force. And he said, you need a president at this time in history who can stand up to his bureaucracy. And I thought that was very powerful. What do you think,
Yes.
Dave?
This is the most important thing, isn't it? Because this is Kennedy blood. I mean, it's bleeding Kennedy blood at this point. As we all know, JFK wanted to take on the establishment, the bureaucracy, the CIA, etc. And here we are at that point that the nephew, RFK Jr., in this massive 2-hour speech that he's given, and it's groundbreaking, and anyone watching will be able to watch this back to get further analysis. We'll be able to understand what's going on. And this was the biggest gripe that many of us had in the Trump presidency, was the fact that the quote just given now, that Trump was bamboozled by his own COVID task force. And you named the names of obviously Fauci and Birx, etc., and others, and it seemed that Operation Warp Speed, somehow Trump has taken all of that and tried to make headway with it, and it seems that this is the one thing that's going to trip him up in all of it. And I still wait and watch to see when he'll retreat, but he won't. Now, Simon, I'm very aware of the time, the limited
okay.
time that we've got.
Let me keep on banging through these.
Good.
Literally just one page, and then let's talk about Ukraine. So he's saying that he talks about regulatory capture, and that is basically where you have like a revolving door of people going industry, government, industry, government, industry, government, and they're always not pursuing the best public policy, but simply trying to make profit for their friends remaining on the boards of these companies that they've just left. And that was very much evident in many of the Biden and also the previous Trump cabinet appointments. He said one example of that was the Department of Transport. And he said, several times in his speech, he used the phrase train wreck. And obviously there he was talking about that enormous spill that had occurred recently when all those cargo cars derailed. He said that the constant wars were caused by contractors owning the CIA. He then went on to say that his daughter-in-law, and this was a surprising revelation, I don't know if he discussed it with her previously, probably was something that he shouldn't have said, had worked her entire life as a clandestine agent at the CIA, and that he knew that there were some good people there, but that there had been problems in leadership for decades. But that having litigated against many government agencies, and he listed a great list of agencies that he'd been involved in lawsuits against, that he knew how they worked, and that he alone, out of all the declared presidential candidates, and I think this is an extremely fair comparison with President Trump, who did not drain the swamp, and he actually kind of used that phrase. He said Trump did not drain the swamp, but he said that he alone knows how to fix all the relevant government agencies. He said when one looks at the amount of money that's spent on healthcare in America, it's $4.3 trillion a year, and that 84% of all of the sickness in America is actually chronic, which goes to show that they're spending all that money and actually the sickness is not being cured, it's just being managed. Which is obviously it's the whole kind of like, pill mill type thing. Just managing your symptoms rather than actually getting to the root cause of the problems. In terms of children, he said that children, when he was young, had a chronic illness rate of about 6%. In 1988, it was 12.8%, and it's now currently running at 54% of all children in America have some type or other of chronic illness. And a gasp went up from the audience at that point. And he said that this is not just obesity, but also neurological orders, ADHD, and of particular concern is autism. He said that when he was a child, which was obviously 60 years ago, 1 in 10,000 were deemed autistic, and that today it's 1 in 34, and specifically said that was not due to just increased analysis and detection and diagnosis. So he put that one back in the box, which is the common excuse. And he said, why aren't we asking the question of why has this happened?
Yes.
And I think here he overpromised, and he may come to regret this in much the same way as Teddy Roosevelt said that he would only run for one term and then really, really regretted that. RFK Jr. said, quote, if I have not significantly reduced a lot of childhood chronic disease by the end of my first term, I don't want to be re-elected. Now, frankly, that's only 4 years. So even if he said no more injections, for an example, theoretical example, for 4 years, you'd still have from age 4 to 18 who have already been injected. So how would he cause a significant drop? So I think there mathematically he's overpromised. Now, the last thing that I'll cover, and then I'm going to have to move on to another presentation, is that he talked at length about Ukraine, and he said that his own son had volunteered as a machine gunner with the Ukrainian Foreign Legion and had fought the Russians around the city of Kharkiv last year. So that certainly gives him a lot of credence, because he must have been watching pretty carefully what was happening in Ukraine if his own son was fighting there. But he said that now America is at the point where they need to have a conversation using, and the phrase he used was nuance and complexity, because he was of the opinion a year plus into the war that it was clear that America had been involved since 2014. Many people would actually trace that back to 2008, when the first invite to Ukraine to join NATO was issued over Russian objections. And despite the CIA director at the time warning very strongly, do not do that, because you'll get the Russians to pile in, they'll have no choice. Nonetheless, that was actually done. Many people don't realize, not last year, but 15 years ago. And so he said that can this conflict, despite ostensible good intentions a year ago, which is clearly a very debatable point, but I'm just telling you what he was contending, even if we went in with the best of intentions a year ago, that it was very hard to see how conflict with this level of expenditure, and he quoted a number, I believe it was $130 billion, which didn't include all the EU money, the British money, the World Bank, the IMF, and all the other sources, Japan, South Korea, all the other, we're well over $200 billion at this point, right? How, when there are this many problems at home, that type of expenditure was in the national interest of the United States. And he said that it was very important for people not to just shout, you're a Nazi lover and you're a Putin lover, and that we need to have a sophisticated conversation to actually really consider at this point what America, and I would suggest also Britain and Australia and Japan, could actually realistically hope to achieve from the current situation. So he didn't do like DeSantis did, where he came out directly against the Ukraine war and then got so hammered that he had to embarrassingly backtrack. He explained that it was a sophisticated problem, that it needed a national conversation, that his own son had been involved in direct combat. And he went on to say that in general terms, and this was extremely powerful, that America's foreign policy had entirely collapsed. Now, that is absolutely without precedent since 1900. I can think of no term when any president or aspiring presidential candidate have not only said that foreign policy was in danger, or that we should stay neutral, like they talked about for the First World War, which is why America joined so late, or that there were problems that could be fixed. He specifically said, past tense, it's over, it has entirely collapsed. Now, he then went on to say that in terms of the dollar, that Saudi Arabia and Brazil were now moving away from the dollar. And if the dollar were to lose its reserve status, then the increased interest costs alone would cost America close to another $1 trillion. Now, one, Saudi Arabia isn't really moving yet, but Brazil and many other countries like India are. So one could quibble and fact check that, but his general sense was correct. And frankly, if foreigners stop buying US Treasury debt, particularly as close as we are to the debt limit, it would probably cost a lot more than $1 trillion. It could be like a real mega meltdown. So he wasn't as brutal with the truth as he might well have been. But we've had slight warnings coming from Secretary Yellen. We've had warnings from Lagarde, but nobody coming out with that kind of full frontal statement. So he's not holding anything back. He's touched upon some incredibly sensitive issues. I think he could swing a large percentage of the populace with him, bearing in mind, and this is commonly forgotten, that 45% of the registered American electorate are indeed registered independents. And what may need to occur is to get him over the hump is for Republicans, who are all probably correctly assuming that Trump is going to be the candidate, unless he's literally in prison, for the Republicans, that independents and Republicans, who in many states are prevented from nominating the Democratic candidate unless they change their registration, may well want to think during the remainder of this year of 2023 that the real game in town is to try and give the Republic a decent choice of potentially putting up RFK Jr. So one of the phrases that he used, and once again, this was harking back to cooperation between his father and Martin Luther King in relation to the Civil Rights Act and the presidential campaign of 1960, was poor people participating in party politics, which is 5 Ps and quite hard to say. But that clearly is what is necessary, not only in Australia and Britain and America and Canada, but here now, in terms of people who would otherwise risk their economic circumstances, be it because of the Democratic Party or the Republicans, or indeed the WF overlords, getting substantially worse. So he's very much calling for everyone to get involved. And I would strongly encourage the audience to not necessarily choose this candidate. I'm not advocating one particular person. But I think the general call of getting involved, particularly in Britain, we've got the local elections in 2.5, 3 weeks, right? To really step up in campaigns that otherwise have low percentage turnouts, because you can see from the comments that this person in particular has been making, it is extremely anti-establishment. Just telling the truth alone, let alone telling the truth about specific incidents and specific people and specific policies, and taking on big pharma and the military-industrial complex and the CIA by name, right? That's not going to be popular with certain segments of the 1% of society.
Of course.
So in order for them to have any hope of success, they're going to need a lot of support. And it's important to remember that in Eisenhower's famous retirement speech, when he mentioned the military-industrial complex, that was not the original draft. The original draft that was changed was the military media industrial complex. Wow. But when they were given the advanced transcript, the 4 American terrestrial news companies at the time, which obviously was NBC, CBS, ABC, and I forget the last one, they refused to air the president's speech unless media was deleted from the draft.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible, as was this report, Simon. Robert Kennedy Jr. announcing his candidacy for president. as part of the Democratic Party, he has become anti-establishment to the max. It puts him not necessarily at the front, but it gets him onto the stage at least in a presidential showdown with Biden, who will make him look silly. He does carry the raspy voice that is a disability on its own, but it presents now that Trump, the anti-establishment Republican hot favourite to win the nomination, and RFK Jr. to do a whole lot of truth-telling, which will mean damage control for establishment Democrats and the establishment deep state, whichever way you want to call it or look at it, in this massive, massive announcement today. It is truly astonishing. And if you're watching and you want to share and get involved, now is the time to decide if you're going to become a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent in the upcoming primary vote for who will become president. And we'll see what's going on. Kennedy is also a lawyer by trade, and it'll be interesting to see that if he isn't going to necessarily win the White House, whether he will be on some candidate, maybe an attorney general, maybe some other position on a cabinet. And it seems that he's got a lot to say, and that Kennedy name is not going anywhere. Brand names on both sides of the anti-establishment candidacy. Simon, it has been terrific to get you on the show. What have you got before you go?
Just if I may just add a couple of sentences there to your excellent conclusion. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I would like to mention that beyond us generally liking to have our cooperation and our work better known, because of the nature of this 2-hour speech, most people are not going to be presented this information by their mainstream media. They're going to get a 5 or 10 minute summary. Now, without boasting, people need to understand that you and I have worked on this for many, many hours today since this came out. And what I would ask people to do is just consider the depth of analysis that we have provided. Things like telling the truth marching on, the battle hymn of the Republic, all of the historical information about why he chose today, why he chose the location, the fight against British oppression. These are all important factors. And if people watch their regular ABC 9 news or read the Morning Herald or whatever they get for their general information sources, please, I would invite them to compare what they have heard tonight to what they are told tomorrow. And I suggest that it will be very, very de minimis and very different and very insulting that the terms that will be used for Robert Kennedy Jr. because of his interest in medical safety. And so I'll try and bring this level of analysis to other aspects of the primary campaign, as I do with the INFTC and Middle East politics and the Greater Eurasian Partnership. But the only way that it's of value to society is if people share this information. And so just like pantomime, it is a participation activity.
Well said. You couldn't have put it any better. I know you've got to go. You've got more big shows lined up, and I thank you for taking the time to create over an hour of analysis here on the historic RFK Jr. speech. Simon, has been terrific, and we'll regroup again with more developments in this news and other news as we see the world being restructured. But America, she's not dead yet, as RFK Jr. stands up and puts his, goodness me, he puts his face out there in the big scheme of things. I'm going to play the last 30 seconds as we conclude. Thanks for watching. Please share far and wide, and I look forward to bringing you more information on future shows on World Series News. Jason Q Citizen, you can watch on Facebook, YouTube, and Rumble, and also Jason Q Citizen 1 on Twitter. Thanks, everyone. Please share. It's the only way we get to change the world. And goodness me, when the Kennedys are up, it means where there is life, there is hope. Thanks, everyone. See you on the next show.